He arrived in Philadelphia soaked by rain, pockets stuffed with clothes, and 3 rolls of bread tucked under his arms. Laughed at by strangers, broke and unknown. No one watching that muddy 17-year-old could have guessed he would one day stand before kings, tame lightning from the sky, help create a nation, and become one of the most famous minds in history. This is how Benjamin Franklin's extraordinary journey began. Benjamin Franklin, the 15th in a family of 17 children, was born in Boston in 1706. Benjamin learned to read when he was very young, but he was sent to school for only 2 years. When he was 10 years old, he had to help his father. Franklin's father made his living by boiling soap and making tallow candles. Little Benjamin had to cut wicks for the candles, fill the molds with the melted tallow, tend the shop, and run on errands. He did not like the soap and candle trade. Playing about the water, he had learned to swim and to manage a boat when he was very young. Like many other boys, he got the notion that it would be a fine thing to go to sea and be a sailor, but his father did not think so. Franklin and his playmates used to fish for minnows in a mill pond which had a salt marsh for a shore, so that the boys had to stand in the mud. He was a leader among the boys and already very ingenious. So he proposed that the boys should build a little wharf in this marsh to stand on. Near the marsh there was a pile of stones, put there to be used in building a new house. In the evening, when the workmen were gone, Franklin and the other boys tugged and toiled until they had managed to carry all these stones away and build them into a wharf or pier, reaching out into the water. In the morning, the workmen were very much surprised to find that their pile of stones had walked away during the night. They soon found out where the stones were and complained to the parents of the boys. Franklin and some of the other boys were punished for their mischief. Benjamin tried to make his father see that it was a very useful work to build such a pier, but the father soon showed him that nothing was useful that was not honest. When Franklin had worked for 2 years with the father at the trade of making tallow candles, the father began to be afraid that Ben would run away and go to sea, as another of his sons had done before. So Franklin's father took him to walk with him sometimes, showing him men working at their trades, such as bricklaying, turning, and joining, hoping that the boy would take a fancy to one of these occupations. Meantime, Benjamin became very fond of reading. He read his father's books, which were very dull for children, and he sold some little things of his own to buy more. As the boy was so fond of books, Benjamin's father could think of nothing better than to make him a printer. So Benjamin was apprenticed to his older brother, James Franklin, who already had a printing office. Benjamin liked this trade and learned very fast. As he was often sent to bookstores, he got a chance to borrow books. He sometimes sat up all night to read one of these, taking great care to keep the books clean and to return them soon. Benjamin took a fancy to write poetry about this time. His brother printed this wretched stuff, as Franklin afterwards called it, and sent the boy around the town to peddle it. Ben was very proud of his poetry, until his father made fun of it and told him that verse makers were generally beggars. Franklin had a notion as a boy that it was wrong to eat meat, so he told his brother that if he would give him half of what his board cost, he would board himself. After this, Benjamin made his dinner on biscuit or a tart from the baker's. In this way, he saved some of his board money to buy books and used the time while the other printers were at dinner to study. James Franklin, Benjamin's brother, printed a little newspaper. Franklin was printer's boy and paper carrier, for after he had worked at printing the papers, he carried them around to the houses of the subscribers. But he also wanted to write for the paper. He did not dare propose such a bold thing to his brother, so he wrote some articles and put them under the printing office door at night. They were printed, and even Benjamin's brother did not suspect that they were written by the boy. The two brothers did not get on well together. The younger brother was rather saucy, and the older brother, who was high-tempered, sometimes gave him a whipping. James Franklin once printed something in his newspaper which offended the government of the colony. He was arrested and put into prison for a month, for the press was not free in that day. Benjamin published the paper while his brother was in prison and put in the sharpest things he dared to say about the government. After James got out of prison, he was forbidden to print a newspaper any longer, so he made up his mind to print it in the name of his brother Benjamin. In order to do this, he was obliged to release Benjamin Franklin from his apprenticeship, though it was agreed that Ben was to remain at work for his brother, as though still an apprentice, till he was 21 years old. But Benjamin soon got into another quarrel with his brother James, and now that he was no longer bound, he left him. This was not fair on his part, and he was afterwards sorry for it. Tell. How Franklin and his friends built a wharf. About Franklin's father and how Franklin came to learn the printing business. How Franklin managed to get books and time to read them. Of Franklin's first writings. Of Franklin's brother and his imprisonment. Of Franklin's quarrels with his brother. When Ben Franklin left his brother, he tried in vain to get a place in one of the other printing offices in Boston. But James Franklin had sent word to the other printers not to take Benjamin into their employ. There was no other town nearer than New York large enough to support a printing office. Franklin, who was now but 17 years old, sold some of his books and secretly got aboard a sloop ready to sail to New York. In New York, he could find no work, but was recommended to try in Philadelphia. The modes of travel in that time were very rough. The easiest way of getting from Boston to New York was by sailing vessels. To get to Philadelphia, Franklin had first to take a sailboat to Amboy in New Jersey. On the way, a squall of wind tore the sails and drove the boat to anchor near the Long Island shore, where our runaway boy lay all night in the little hold of the boat, with the waves beating over the deck and the water leaking down on him. When at last he landed in Amboy, it had been 30 hours without anything to eat or any water to drink. Having but little money in his pocket, he had to walk from Amboy to Burlington, and when, soaked with rain, he stopped at an inn, he cut such a figure that the people came near arresting him for a runaway bondservant, of whom there were many at that time. He thought he might better have stayed at home. This tired and mud-bespattered young fellow got a chance to go from Burlington to Philadelphia in a rowboat by taking his turn at the oars. There were no street lamps in the town of Philadelphia, and the men in the boat passed the town without knowing it. Like forlorn tramps, they landed and made a fire of some fence rails. When they got back to Philadelphia in the morning, Franklin, who was to become in time the most famous man in that town, walked up the street in his working clothes, which were badly soiled by his rough journey. His spare stockings and shirt were stuffed into his pockets. He bought 3 large rolls at a baker's shop. One of these he carried under each arm, the other he munched as he walked. As he passed along the street, a girl named Deborah Reed stood in the door of her father's house and laughed at the funny sight of a young fellow with bulging pockets and a roll under each arm. Years afterwards, this same Deborah Reed was married to Franklin. Franklin got a place to work with a printer named Keimer. He was now only a poor printer boy in leather breeches such as working men wore at that time. But though he looked poor, he was already different from most of the boys in Philadelphia. He was a lover of good books. The boy who has learned to read the best books will be an educated man, with or without schools. The great difference between people is shown in the way they spend their leisure time. Franklin, when not studying, spent his evenings with a few young men who were also fond of books. Here is the sort of young man that will come to something. I suppose people began to notice and talk about this studious working man. One day, Keimer, the printer for whom Franklin was at work, saw, coming toward his office, Sir William Keith, the governor of the province of Pennsylvania, and another gentleman, both finely dressed after the fashion of the time, in powdered periwigs and silver knee buckles, much as you see in the picture on the next page.
Keimer was delighted to have such visitors, and he ran down to meet the great men. But imagine his disappointment when the governor asked to see Franklin and led away the young printer in leather breeches to talk with him in the tavern.
The governor wanted Franklin to set up a printing office of his own, because both Keimer and the other master printer in Philadelphia were poor workmen. But Franklin had no money, and it took a great deal to buy a printing press and types in that day. Franklin told the governor that he did not believe his father would help him to buy an outfit, but the governor wrote a letter himself to Franklin's father asking him to start Benjamin in business. So Franklin went back to Boston in a better plight than that in which he had left. He had on a brand new suit of clothes, he carried a watch, and he had some silver in his pockets. His father and mother were glad to see him once more, but his father told him he was too young to start in business for himself. Franklin returned to Philadelphia. Governor Keith, who was one of those fine gentlemen that make many promising speeches, now offered to start Franklin himself. He wanted him to go to London to buy the printing press. He promised to give the young man letters to people in London, and one that would get him the money to buy the press. But somehow, every time that Franklin called on the governor for the letters, he was told to call again. At last, Franklin went on shipboard, thinking the governor had sent the letters in the ship's letter bag. Before the ship got to England, the bag was opened, and no letters for Franklin were found. A gentleman now told Franklin that Keith made a great many such promises, but he never kept them. Fine clothes do not make a fine gentleman. So Franklin was left in London without money or friends. But he got work as a printer and learned some things about the business that he could not learn in America. The English printers drank a great deal of beer. They laughed at Franklin because he did not drink beer, and they called him the Water American. But he wasn't a fellow to be afraid of ridicule. They told him that water would make him weak, but they were surprised to find him able to lift more than any of them. He was also the strongest and most expert swimmer of all. In London, he kept up his reading. He paid a man who kept a second-hand bookstore for permission to read his books. Franklin came back to Philadelphia as clerk for a merchant, but the merchant soon died, and Franklin went to work again for his old master, Keimer. He was very useful, for he could make ink and cast type when they were needed, and he also engraved some designs on type metal. Keimer once fell out with Franklin and discharged him, but he begged him to come back when there was some paper money to be printed, with Keimer could not print without Franklin's help in making the engravings. Squall, a sudden and violent gust of wind. Bond servant, a person sold into a kind of slavery for 4 years or more to pay his passage from Europe, according to a practice very common in the last century. Bulging, swelling out. Periwig, a wig, a cap of false hair, much worn by fashionable gentlemen in former times, and usually sprinkled with a white powder. Knee buckles, buckles used to fasten the short breeches worn in old times just below the knees and to hold up the long stockings. Outfit, articles of every sort necessary to begin any business, journey, or expedition with. Plight, condition. Printing press, a machine by which paper is pressed against type covered with ink, any machine for printing. Type metal, a mixed metal used to make types for printing. Tell about Franklin's journey from Boston to Philadelphia, about his arrival in Philadelphia, his life in Philadelphia, his journey to England, his return to Philadelphia. After a time, Franklin started a printing office of his own. He was very much in debt for his printing press and types. To pay for them, he worked very hard. Men saw him at work when they got up in the morning, and when they went to bed at night, the candle in his office was still shining. When he wanted paper, he would sometimes take the wheelbarrow himself and bring it from the store at which he bought it to his printing office. People began to say, "What an honest, hard-working young man that Franklin is. He is sure to get on."
And then, to help him get on, they brought their work to his office. He started a newspaper. Now, his reading of good books and his practice in writing since he was a little boy helped him. He could write intelligently on almost any subject, and his paper was the best one printed in all America at that time. Franklin married Miss Deborah Reed, the same who had laughed when she saw him walking the street with a roll under each arm and his spare clothes in his pockets. His wife helped him to attend the shop, for he sold stationery in connection with his printing. They kept no servant, and Franklin ate his breakfast of plain bread and milk out of an earthen porringer with a pewter spoon. In time, he paid off all his debts and began to grow rich. In those days, books were scarce, and people had but few of them. But everybody bought an almanac. Franklin published one of these useful little pamphlets every year. It was known as Poor Richard's Almanac, because it pretended to be written by a poor man named Richard Saunders, though everybody knew that Richard was Franklin himself. This almanac was very popular on account of the wise and witty sayings of Poor Richard about saving time and money. Franklin did not spend all his time making money. He studied hard as usual and succeeded in learning several languages without the help of a teacher. This knowledge was afterwards of the greatest use to him. Like other people in America at that time, he found it hard to get the books he wanted. To help himself and to do good to others, he started a public library in Philadelphia, which was the first ever started in America. Many like it were established in other towns, and the people in America soon had books within their reach. It was observed after a while that plain people in America knew more than people in the same circumstances in other countries. Franklin did many other things for the public. Seeing how wasteful the old fireplaces were, since they burned a great deal of wood and made the rooms cold and full of drafts, and often filled the house with smoke, he invented a system of saving heat by means of a small iron fireplace or open stove. He founded a high school, which afterwards became a great university. When the frontier people were slain by Indians during the French War, he was the chief man in raising and arming troops for their relief. These and other acts of the sort made Franklin well known in Pennsylvania, but he presently did one thing which made him famous all the world over. This one thing was accomplished in a very short time, but it came from the habits of study he formed when he was a little boy. He was always reading to get more knowledge and making experiments to find out things. People did not know a great deal about electricity at that time. In Europe, many learned men were trying to find out what they could about variously sorts of electricity, and lectures on the subject had been given in Philadelphia. Something made Franklin think that the electricity which was produced by a machine was of the same nature as the lightning in the sky. So he devised a plan to find out. He set a trap to catch the lightning. He made a kite by stretching a silk handkerchief on a frame. Then he fastened a metal point to the kite and tied a hemp string to it to fly it with. He thought that if lightning were electricity, it would go from the metal point down the hemp string. At the lower end of the string, he tied a key and a silk string to catch hold of, so that he should not let the electricity escape through his hand. Franklin knew that if a grown man were seen flying a kite, he would soon be surrounded by a crowd. So one stormy night he went out and sent up his kite. He waited under a shed to see if the electricity would come. When he saw the little fibers of the hemp stand up charged with electricity, he held his hand near the key and felt a shock. Then he went home, the only man in the world that knew certainly that lightning was electricity. When he had found out this secret, he invented the lightning rod, which takes electricity from the air to the earth and keeps it from doing harm. When the learned men of Europe heard that a man who had hardly ever been to school had made a great discovery, they were struck with wonder, and Franklin was soon considered one of the great men of the world and was called Dr. Franklin. When the troubles between England and her colonies began, there was no one so suitable to make peace as the famous Dr. Franklin. Franklin went to England and tried hard to settle matters, but he would not consent to any plan by which Americans should give up their rights. When the war broke out, Dr. Franklin came home again. He was made a member of Congress, and he helped to make the Declaration of Independence. After the Americans had declared themselves independent, they found it a hard task to fight against so powerful a country as England. They wanted to get some other country to help them. So Franklin, who was well known in Europe and who had studied French when he was a poor printer, was sent to France. When Franklin went to France, he had to appear at the finest court in the world. But in the midst of all the display and luxury of the French court, he wore plain clothes and did not pretend to be anything more than he was in Philadelphia. This pleased the French, who admired his independent spirit and called him the philosopher. He persuaded the French government to give money and arms to the Americans. He fitted out vessels to attack English ships, and during the whole War of the Revolution, he did much for his country. When the war was ended, there came the hard task of making peace. In this, Franklin took a leading part. When peace had been made, Dr. Franklin set out to leave Paris. As he was old and feeble, the Queen's litter, which was carried by mules, was furnished to him. On this litter, he traveled till he reached the sea. After he got home, he was the most honored man in America, next to Washington. He became a member of the Convention of 1787, which formed the Constitution of the United States. He died in 1790 at the age of 84. When Franklin was a boy, his father used to repeat to him Solomon's proverb, "Seest thou a man diligent in his business? He shall stand before kings." This was always an encouragement to him, though he did not expect really to stand before kings, but he was presented to 5 different kings in his lifetime.
Porringer, a kind of bowl out of which porridge is eaten. Drafts. Frontier, the outer edge of white men's settlements next the Indian country. Frontier people, in the text, are the people living nearest to the wilderness occupied by Indians. Fibers, fine, thread-like bits, such as you will find if you pick a piece of twine to pieces, and which may be seen sticking out from a piece of rough string. Shock, the feeling that one has on receiving electricity into the person from a body charged with it. Court here means the palace of a king, also the attendants and ministers who are about his person or carry on his government. Luxury, rich food, dress, and pleasures of any kind. Philosopher, one who acts calmly and wisely according to reason. Litter, a framework supporting a sort of bed on which a person may be carried by men or horses. Constitution, in our country, a written plan of government which tells how and by whom the laws shall be made and carried out, and what kind of laws may be made, and what kind may not be made.
Tell in your own words about how Franklin succeeded in his own printing office, his industry, his economy, his newspaper, his almanac. Tell also of his other employments, his studies, the public library that he founded, the fireplace he invented, his public services in the French War. Tell what you can about his great discovery. Tell about his services during the Revolution, what he did in England, what he did in France, his return home when he was old. From a poor candle-maker's son with little schooling, Benjamin Franklin rose by diligence, curiosity, and honest labor to become one of the greatest men of his age. He taught himself through books, improved every trade he touched, and used his knowledge not only to earn a living, but to serve the public good. As a printer, inventor, scientist, and statesman, Franklin proved that learning and character matter more than wealth or birth.
His life showed that steady industry, wise use of time, and a love of knowledge can lift an ordinary boy to stand among the founders of a nation and before the rulers of the world. If this journey through history sparked your curiosity, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Tell us which explorer or historical figure you want to uncover next, because the past is packed with bold risks, untold stories, and forgotten paths that quietly reshaped the world we live in today.